Welcome to Taking Up Space, the podcast with conversations exploring what it means to inhabit our bodies fully without shame or apology and reconnect with our innate wisdom to find healing and body liberation. I'm your host, Cassie Krajewski, a licensed clinical social worker, certified sex therapist, and certified body trust practitioner. For over 10 years, I've worked with women and marginalized folks to reclaim their bodies, their inner knowing, and their lives in a world that often seeks to diminish their voices and experiences. In this podcast, we'll unpack the societal norms and expectations that interrupt our embodiment, like trauma, oppression, illness and pain, and the social constructs of gender, race, sexuality, beauty, health, and weight. My hope is that through this podcast, we'll learn to drop into our bodies and give ourselves permission to occupy space, physically, emotionally, relationally, and intellectually, with more confidence and authenticity. Join us as we challenge societal norms, explore what it means to find wholeness and reclaim our right to take up space as an act of resistance and body liberation. While this podcast might feel therapeutic, it is not psychotherapy and doesn't constitute a therapist-client relationship. This is a good time to mention, too, that this podcast will at times use adult language, so listener discretion is advised. If you are interested in diving in deeper, make sure you check out my online shop where I'm currently offering my Taking Up Space workbook for free. This workbook includes thought-provoking exercises, reflective journal prompts, and actionable strategies that can help guide you towards a deeper understanding of yourself and your needs and cultivate a more profound sense of embodiment and your own liberation. You can find this workbook and other resources at my website. That's inneratlastherapy.com/shop. Hey there, welcome back to Taking Up Space. I'm really glad you're here because today we have an amazing interview with Dawn Serra. So if you don't know Dawn Serra, she is a counselor and coach from British Columbia. And Dawn's here to share about her journey from hosting an MLM sex toy party to becoming now an amazing sex and relationship coach. Here's a little bit more about Dawn. Dawn is a white, cis, queer, super fat, disabled therapist specializing in relationships, pleasure, and body trust. She's the co-founder of Tend and Cultivate Counseling, a mental health group practice providing trauma-informed, weight-neutral, radical mental health care for people in bigger bodies. The nexus of her work is tending to the places where we are most tender and cultivating the things that contribute to our aliveness, joy, pleasure, connection, satisfaction, and wonder. With all of that, I feel like Dawn and I are just kindred spirits. I resonate so much with Dawn's work. She has an incredible blog. She hosted a podcast for many years that has over 2 million views called Sex Gets Real. And we're going to talk about many different components of Dawn's work and her expertise today. We're going to talk about fat activism, body trust, the importance of non-stigmatizing mental health care for people in larger bodies. Dawn's going to share more about how pleasure work is worthiness work and how boundary setting and reclaiming pleasure and sexuality, specifically for marginalized groups, is a pathway to liberation. We're also going to talk about desirability politics and how societal norms shape our perceptions of attractiveness and self-worth. Dawn's insights truly are so profound and really informative for those of us who are in a path of reclaiming our bodies and experiences from oppressive cultural narratives. Dawn also shares about her personal story of her own struggle with her body and food and dieting, and how she has navigated her own path to fat activism and doing the work that she does, fostering self-acceptance and self-love for all of those that she encounters. Thanks for being here. I love this conversation so much, and I hope you enjoy. Here's my conversation with Dawn Serra. Hey there, Dawn. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Me too. I love your work so much. I love your podcast. I love your blogs. There's just so much that you've contributed to my own learning, and it's a treat to get to talk with you a little bit more in depth. So
Yeah.
Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
We can start with you sharing a little bit more about who you are and the work that you like to do.
I am a counselor up here in Canada. I'm in just outside Vancouver, British Columbia, and I'm also a coach. And I got started in this realm years ago. I was doing those like MLM sex toy parties, like
Oh,
Tupperware
yeah.
parties.
Oh, yes. What was it, like pure
Yeah.
romance or what was it?
I can't even slumber parties.
Oh, slumber.
Parties. Yeah. Lots of terrible products, but I got into that just purely for fun
Mhm.
and really fell in love with the private times with all of these women where
Mhm.
they would share how ashamed they were of body, how hard it was to advocate for themselves.
Yeah.
So many women who were in their 30s and 40s and married had never masturbated and never had a sex
Mhm.
toy. And there was something really special about being able to be that beacon of permission.
Mm.
And that got me really interested in the space of how can I help hold space for more freedom, more permission in this
Mm.
arena. And so I started doing sex and relationship coaching back in 2014,
Mhm.
and that morphed. I realized so many of the issues around sex really came from boundaries, communication, self worth, body. I got
Yeah.
certified as a body trust provider, and that also intersected with my own really complex relationship with my body.
Mhm.
I've
Oh, say
always been,
more.
yeah,
Hmm.
I've always been in a bigger body, even like basically from when puberty hit, my
Yeah.
body was bigger than my peers.
Mhm.
Now, looking back, I would by no means say that I was in a fat body, but
Mhm.
definitely I was bigger than my peers. And so I was like the fat friend or the person that kind of got pointed to as the bigger one.
Mhm.
And dieting was encouraged from a young age by my
Mhm.
parents
Yeah.
who had complex relationships with their bodies. I can remember starting to really thinking about dieting when I was like 10, 11, 12,
Mhm.
and having my food monitored as I got older and my body got bigger. And
Mm.
so for me, I spent most of my teens, all of my 20s, and into my early 30s, either dieting or having a very disordered relationship with food.
Mhm.
And that impacted how I felt like I could show up,
Yeah.
the treatment I accepted from people
Mhm.
I was dating or having sex with. And so that really started shifting for me when I found fat activism.
Mhm.
And that was a pretty radical, scary place to be of maybe my body isn't the problem.
Yes.
I stumbled across it was a blog post at the time, but she has since turned it into a book. But I stumbled across a blog post by Jess Baker. And at
Mhm.
the time, I want to say the blog post was 10 things nobody'll tell fat girls.
Mhm.
And every single thing on the list was a thing that I had internalized as a big problem.
Mhm.
And here was this person who was fun loving and playful and being so unapologetic. And that kind of rocked my world a little bit. And I started looking for more.
Mm.
And that moved me into a space of really questioning a lot of the stories I had. And so when I started seeing that show up in the work, I realized this is a really important space for me. It feels personal, but also global and cultural. And so the past couple of years, the real focus of my work has been in supporting non stigmatizing mental health care for folks in fat bodies.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I also still work with couples and do a lot of work around sex and intimacy and pleasure, but it's this space of how we inhabit our bodies, how we make sense of our bodies, and also the reality of how the world treats people in bigger
Yes.
bodies, right? It's not just a thing we make up in our head.
Right. This is real and this is
Yeah.
happening. What are some of the unique mental health needs that you support folks in larger bodies with in your work
Yeah.
with them?
One of the biggest is just simply being able to be in a space where your provider has a shared live experience of being in a fat body automatically just shifts the tone.
Yeah.
And so many of my clients have come to me and said, I had a great therapist, but she was constantly encouraging me to eat better. Or when my doctor said I should have loss surgery, my therapist said, that'd be great for you. And
Oh,
just exactly
wow.
these micro and macro aggressions, and even, folks in bigger bodies who have active eating disorders and then having their therapists talk about restriction.
Mm,
It's just a conversational starter of the session.
right.
And so for me, that's just where we start
Mm,
is you
mm,
get to come into a space with somebody who experiences this on a daily basis too.
mhm,
And then a lot of what we also explore is the harms of medical fat phobia,
mhm.
constantly being told to diet, to lose weight, to seek weight loss surgery. And then there's just the inevitable complexities of like, how do I learn to accept myself in a world that fundamentally does not accept me?
Mhm, mhm,
And how do I navigate relationships in ways that are honoring of my body and not relationships where I'm tolerated? So,
mhm,
those are some of the really meaty, important places of how I'm doing this work right now.
mhm. Yeah, I really appreciate how you've shared your lived experience and how your own body story informs how you've arrived at this really incredible specialization, and the ways in which you offer yourself in that space is such a beautiful thing, and something that I have learned from my body trust work and fat liberation work is like adding body size to your intersectional lens is critical, right?
Mhm.
Part of what you're describing here is an essential part of that. There is value in sharing identities in the therapy space, and this is one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for folks who are looking for a mental health professional, you may not be able to find a fat therapist that's licensed in your area, but still trying to find somebody who has that critical lens is a great first step.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. One of the cool things that I love that you bring together is fat liberation work and pleasure and
Mhm.
sexuality. So cool. And I'm also just mindful of what you just said of all the ways in which I think people in larger bodies or fat bodies feel like they need to apologize for their
Mhm.
body, especially in dating or relationships or sex. And I'm curious how you support people in that, what it looks like to really reclaim sexuality in a
Mhm.
culture that otherwise says that you shouldn't be sexual or you can only be acceptable and sexual when
Yeah.
your body looks a certain way. How do you navigate that?
It's tricky because a lot of people in bigger bodies have the experience of being fetishized.
Yes.
Whether you're disabled or you're Black or Asian or fat, if you in some way are seen as other or taboo, you're largely going to experience rejection.
Mhm.
But then there's going to be that counterculture of people who have hypersexualized your otherness. And
Mhm.
there's a real dehumanizing element to that. Now, some people enjoy being fetishized because there can be some power that you
Yeah.
play with
Mhm.
around that. But I have had so many clients come to me and say, I thought I met somebody who was amazing. And then I discovered it was really just because they wanted access to my fat body and it wasn't me as a
Mm.
person. And so that's a tricky place to be. I think the starting point for so much of the work that I do with people is really figuring out what people feel worthy of. Do I really
Mm.
have this belief that someone's at best going to tolerate me?
Mm.
I'm probably going to accept treatment that's pretty bad
Mhm.
because I'm coming from this place of if someone wants to date me, I better cling to it because I'm not going to get anything else. There's a real scarcity mindset.
Mhm.
And I find that happens so often for people that they accept mistreatment because there's some kind of internalized belief that no one could ever want me. So if someone shows me interest, I better take it.
Mm.
And so doing a lot of work around worthiness, around taking up space,
Yeah.
around really believing that I bring something potent and powerful and beautiful to the table, and that there are people out there who will accept, love, appreciate you regardless of your body size.
Mhm.
And that's a tough place just because we do live in a culture that sees fat bodies as inherently subhuman. But that
Mhm.
doesn't mean everybody subscribes to that. It
Right.
might mean we have to be a little more discerning, but we're all deserving of that kind
Mhm.
of care. And so for me, we start with kind of worthiness. And I also do a lot of work with people when we're talking about dating and relationships. How do you treat your own body? Do
Mhm.
you feel worthy of pleasure? Do you prioritize your own needs? If you aren't prioritizing your own needs, if you're not prioritizing your own body, your own pleasure, it's going to be really difficult to do that when you're in the presence of another, because
Yeah.
inherently it is vulnerable to make
Right.
ourselves known to another. And if
Mm.
I show up in a space that's very sexualized and heightened, to make myself known to another, especially naked, is really hard for most of us, much less
Yeah.
somebody who's in a body who's taking in messages every single day that your body is wrong.
I've seen this in some of your different content that you say pleasure work is worthiness work. And even as you're talking about deserving of needs and saying, I get to have this too, this is not something that I have to accommodate myself for. I get to
Yeah.
prioritize myself. I think that's such huge reclamation work that
Hmm.
can feel really challenging to do, like you said, with all the cultural variables. And also, I'm guessing you have lots of examples of folks you've worked with
Yeah.
that have found their way through this and have a reclamation of their desire and their pleasure and their sexuality, regardless of however their body is or changes or anything like that.
Yeah. One of the extraordinary things that I stumbled on, I'm not the only one, in my work was I found so often that people's relationship with food was really indicative of their relationship with pleasure on the whole. If
Yes,
I don't
let's
feel
go
like
there.
I can
Mhm.
eat the things I want to eat until I'm satisfied,
Mhm.
there's an inherent kind of shrinking of accepting what I need, what my body wants. And often that was paralleled in all the other spaces where body had needs and wants and desires. And so that was an interesting thing to connect, that if someone's saying, "Hey, I'm really struggling with sex. I've
Mhm.
never had an orgasm. I
Mhm.
don't know how to ask for what I want." If we took several steps back, do you know how to ask for what you want when it's mealtime? Do
Yeah.
you say, "I want
Right.
XYZ," or are you doing the mental mathematics of diet culture and trying to decide what you should have? It's going to be really hard to ask for what you want during sex
Mhm.
if you struggle to ask for what you want in
Mhm.
just your day-to-day life. We have to start a couple paces back.
Mhm. That's a parallel that I've seen and overlap I've seen too. It's no
Mhm.
accident that I became an eating disorders therapist and a sex therapist. How we relate to pleasure, desires,
Yeah.
appetites of all kinds, I think
Mhm.
is really profound.
Yeah.
And as you were sharing there too, I it makes me think about this cultural messaging around who deserves to have
Mhm.
desire, or who's it socially acceptable to have a desire and appetite or
Yeah.
pleasure. And I'm hearing certainly for people in larger bodies, there's so much messaging around they shouldn't be able to enjoy certain foods or whatever.
Mhm.
But that's applied more broadly in all kinds of ways with lots of
Yeah.
marginalized groups.
Yes. Absolutely. We can see this so easily when we think about folks who are experiencing poverty, folks who are financially disenfranchised.
Mhm.
And we see so many narratives around they can't even afford food. Why do they have a cell phone?
Oh, yeah.
So we have this hierarchy in our mind of you need to have a certain level of financial access, or you need to have a certain kind of body, or you need to have a certain kind of look in order to access leisure and
Mhm.
play and pleasure. And that's by design. We're
Mhm.
existing inside of a hierarchy that
Mhm.
really wants to move resources up to the top at the expense of the folks that are seen as belonging at the bottom. And so that brings with it all kinds of stories around disabled folks.
Mhm.
Certainly, disabled folks and fat folks are desexualized. Their autonomy is
Mhm.
often questioned and taken away. We definitely see the desexualization and the simultaneous hypersexualization of Black girls, Black
Mhm.
women.
Mhm.
So a lot of these feelings that we carry inside of us at a very individual level about body, pleasure, and sex are there because they were placed upon us
Yeah.
by this larger cultural narrative that has ties to many systems of oppression.
Mhm.
And so the work that I've found is so important is externalizing what isn't ours to carry
Mhm.
at a personal level, to tie it to systems, and then to really take ownership of what is ours, which is our body, our
Mhm.
experience, our feelings, our sensations. Those are mine to get to know and to inhabit. My behaviors, those are the places where I can really start getting curious. If this isn't mine, what is?
Yeah, that's powerful. I thinking about all these cultural stories that get put upon us and how marginalized groups are suffering more intensely under these
Mhm,
stories,
mhm.
just how it cuts people off from even
Yeah.
being able to ask the question of what do I want? What feels good? How might I be able to give that to myself? All of those questions are things that some people have never even asked, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
The one of the things that I have cobbled together through a variety of different teachers, mentors, and just experiences. Betty Martin is certainly one of my big influences on this. But I have started teaching folks about the three pillars of pleasure. What I see is
Mhm.
fundamentally required in order for pleasure to be an experience we can have. Pillar two is that context and choice really
Mm.
matter, right? A hand on your back at home when you're surrounded by loved ones feels different than in a busy bus and it's
Yeah,
a
right.
stranger. So the context really matters. And do I have a sense of I'm choosing to be here or is this being done to me? And
Mhm.
what's underneath that is that safety has to come first.
Yeah.
Just from a neurobiological perspective,
Mhm.
we are wired for survival. So if our nervous system feels like I'm not safe enough,
Mhm.
it's going to be mobilizing me
Mhm.
to fight, to flight, to collapse.
Yeah, not the time to reproduce, like, we're in
Exactly.
survival mode.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. I don't care if the flower smells good if the lion's chasing me.
Yeah.
And so I think what's super important for so many people is lots of us are in survival mode right now for a
Right.
lot of reasons. Cost of living expenses are going through the roof with inflation, long COVID, pandemics, genocides. There's so much that's happening that so many of us are just barely in survival mode. It's
Mhm.
really difficult
Yeah.
to connect in with safe enough to
Mm.
experience the good stuff. And I say that because if I'm a single mom working three jobs to just barely keep food on the table for my kiddos,
Mhm.
stopping to smell the roses might not be very high on my list.
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
But part of what I invite my clients into is we have this narrative that pleasure is either a nice to have or it happens in these bigger special moments when we go on vacation, when we have
Like, yeah, pinnacle
birthdays.
moments, not day to day.
Exactly.
Mm.
Right. A lot of the work that I do with so many of my clients is what if instead we focus on these micro moments
Mm.
of I feel pretty comfortable when I'm on my commute on the bus. Okay, so when you're on the bus, what if you started orienting towards colors and patterns
Mm.
or your favorite park that you go by,
Mhm.
things that you see or hear or feel that just give you that moment of, oh, that's nice. And
Mhm.
your body just gets that little exhale. And if we can do that 10 times in a day, that's a
Mm.
pretty radical thing for our system. I'm
Mhm.
not trying to say the context of my life needs to be different or isn't true. Yes,
Mhm.
I'm overwhelmed. Yes, I'm burnt out.
Mhm.
And yet, there are still these opportunities of that first inhale of your cup of coffee or tea. If you
Mm,
can just arrive with it for one moment, couple
mm,
of breaths,
mm.
that settles something in our body and gives us just that little bit of access to something that feels aliveness.
Mm. W- I want to come back to the three pillars of pleasure because I
Mhm.
want to know the other two pillars. But
Yeah.
what I'm thinking about right now is Adrienne Marie Brown's work of pleasure
Oh,
activism
yes. Yeah.
and how pleasure is, in a way, social justice work. And
Yeah.
so use the word radical. I think it is
Mhm.
really radical in
Yeah.
our culture of all various systems that want to disconnect us from this type of knowing and this type of beauty and joy and wonder and aliveness.
Yeah.
Yeah. What
Yeah.
are the other two pillars of pleasure? Context and choice. What else?
Yep. So that's pillar two. Pillar one is pleasure only ever happens in the present moment. So you have to arrive.
Oh, yeah.
Even if I'm remembering the best meal I ever had,
Mm,
that memory is being evoked in my body now.
right.
And when I think
Mm,
about the trip I'm excited about that's coming up, or seeing my lover in a couple of weeks, the chills, the thrills, they happen in my body now. So
mm,
pleasure is only ever happening in the present moment. And that does invite us to just arrive. And that's why, even when I'm talking about those micro moments, it's a couple of seconds of being here with the experience, right?
mindful. Hmm.
Exactly. So pleasure
Hmm.
only ever happens in the present moment. So I have to arrive. Pillar two is context and choice, which I have to be safe enough. And
Hmm.
then pillar three is that pleasure happens via the senses. And
Hmm.
so if we connect in with the senses, we begin experiencing pleasure often. What are the sounds that I love? The music, the laughter, the meows and the barks, all those little sounds. What are the textures of fabrics that I really love, or the temperature of water? It really is that simple. If I can arrive in the moment, I feel safe enough, and I can inhale the smell of someone's skin, or taste that piece of chocolate or that cupcake, if I can feel the lotion on my skin, pleasure begins emerging.
Hmm.
And it's also a practice. The more that you practice it, the more it becomes available. That's a lot of Adrienne Marie Brown's work, is what
Hmm.
we do in the smallest moments begins to ripple out into the bigger moments.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Hmm.
there's a real claiming of our body. There's a real connection to
Embodiment.
autonomy and
Yeah.
sovereignty, right? To say,
Yeah.
my body, I get to decide, I get to experience it on my terms. And especially for historically marginalized and currently oppressed folks, the disconnection is by design,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Because then you're moving away from your source of knowing, your source of power and ownership over your body. And so these micro pleasure practices move us closer to power, move us closer to knowing. And
Mm,
that also starts to reveal the things that we don't want to tolerate anymore.
Ooh, when you're dropped in and you're listening to what
Hmm.
your body is giving you, then it's harder to stay with what
Exactly.
doesn't feel good,
Yeah.
doesn't feel pleasurable or
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
And that's that phrase you say of your pleasure is your power.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Exactly. To really be able to say, this is my body. I get to decide what happens to it and when it happens to it. I get to say when enough and when I want more. Those are very powerful, potent things.
Hmm.
Nobody else in the entire universe knows what that piece of chocolate tastes like on your tongue.
Hmm.
Nobody else in the whole world knows what that touch on your arm to you. And
Hmm.
so to really claim that, it's an exciting thing, but it is also a thing that requires some grief work, some reckoning. What are all the
That's what I was
times?
thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah,
The
all the
shadow
times I
side of
didn't
all the
listen.
times you didn't get it.
Exactly. The times I didn't get it, the times I didn't trust myself, the times I abandoned myself. That was
Yeah.
a really heartbreaking one for me. All the times that I knew it was a no, but I said yes.
Yeah.
Or all the times I really wanted a thing, but I said no. when there were always wise reasons for those
Yeah, yeah.
choices,
Mhm.
right? But still, there's some grief. And if only a trusted adult, if only somebody had helped me to feel I could. So there's a little bit of heartbreak in that. But
Mhm.
it definitely now shifts things for me of when something doesn't feel good, I know it doesn't feel good because
Yeah.
I'm connected in with what does.
Mhm.
And I'm more likely to advocate for myself and to set boundaries and to say no when something is too big of an ask. And our companies and organizations and law enforcement really don't want us
Yeah.
to have that knowledge about ourselves. It is Audre Lorde and Uses of the Erotic
Mhm.
talks about the more you feel, the less you're able to tolerate these oppressive systems. And Adrienne Marie Brown's work, so many Black feminists,
Mhm.
but it really is such an important critical thing for us to try and create more spaces where people can drop in and connect in with that moment to understand what their yes and their no is,
Mhm.
because then we can inhabit our lives quite differently.
Yeah, we can individually and then collectively.
Yes.
One of the questions that I was stirring with as you were talking is how all of this work connects with your fat liberation work and your fat
Mhm.
activism work.
There is a scholar out of Toronto who presented at the Weight Stigma Conference in 2023. I want to say her name is, but
Okay.
she was talking about how fat bodies don't just move through hostile spaces, they're marked by them. They're
Mm,
bruised, they're
mm,
scarred,
mm,
right? They're hurt by the chairs that have arms that are too narrow. And that to me was such a powerful phrase, spatial injustice, that fat bodies are marked by the hostile spaces. And I think that ties so importantly to this, in that when you move through the world in a fat body, and it's very similar if you move through the world in a disabled body, spaces are intentionally designed to leave you out. And
yeah,
to exist in those spaces often means choosing to be uncomfortable to in great pain,
yeah.
to force yourself into a chair that cuts into your legs and your hips, to squeeze into stalls and spaces that really don't accommodate your body. And people want to make the body wrong.
Mm,
Although fat bodies have existed for all time, we
right.
see that archaeological digs are digging up art in Turkey right now that dates back to 6000 BCE. And it's this
Mm,
beautiful statue
wow.
of this extraordinarily juicy fat woman with a big apron belly and really thick
Amazing.
thighs and tons
Oh,
of
I haven't heard
rolls.
this. I'm gonna have to check it out.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
she's amazing.
Mm,
And fat bodies have always existed.
yeah.
And yet, we have to move into and through spaces or avoid participating,
Mhm.
right? Where the hope is maybe it just won't hurt. What a
Mhm.
terrible bar,
Yeah.
right? What a terrible bar. If I want to go to the concert or go to the play or go to have dinner with my friends, the hope is maybe the chair will fit me and it won't hurt.
Mm,
So, to orient folks in fat bodies towards pleasure is
yeah.
a very different way to start thinking about inhabiting space.
Mm,
And it does invite, which takes some practice and some courage and some vulnerability, advocating for yourself.
yeah.
I will not sit in a chair that's
Mm,
uncomfortable. What will you do about that restaurant? This is
mhm.
not my problem.
Mm,
That is your problem. Right. And also, hopefully, cultivating relationships with people who see your pleasure and your comfort as vital, not nice to have.
mhm.
And
Mm,
that also comes with a lot of grief work. So many people that I work with start to finally put words and conscious thought to something that they've long felt, which is a lot of the relationships I have in my life are with people who tolerate my body,
yeah.
not people who say, I love you and your body, and your comfort and pleasure matter. So I will make different choices to ensure you feel good when we're in these spaces together. It's a
Mhm.
very different kind of friendship and partnership and relating. And most of us don't have that.
Mhm.
And so there's also additional grief work there.
Mhm.
But to exist in a fat body often means to try and actively shrink constantly in public
Mhm.
spaces. And
Mhm.
to start orienting towards pleasure is so beautifully apt because of your podcast, is an act of taking up space, of being visible and making it known
Mhm.
that my body deserves to be here and I deserve to feel good.
Mhm. Mhm. Mm. Just want to take that in.
Yeah.
Like, that's beautiful, beautifully said. And one of the, as you were talking about grief work, thinking about a number of people that I've worked with over the years, and also conversations I've had on this podcast already around what it means to engage in body liberation, fat liberation work, and then the relationships that you built pre engaging in that work, and then how you
Yeah.
relate with them after, and constant dialogue with folks around my partner no longer is attracted to my body. Maybe they never were, maybe they aren't now as my body is changing for whatever reason. And one of the pieces that I know you've written about and have talked about is desirability politics.
Yes.
And I have found some of that work really helpful in informing some of these conversations I've had with clients over the years. But I'm wondering if we could talk about that a little bit
Mhm.
in this space of what desirability politics are and how a recognition of those things can really be informing of someone's process as they're considering what it means to take up space in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much tied up in who we find desirable beyond personal preference.
Mhm.
Now, we have been taught that it's personal preference, it's just a preference.
I
Oh,
just like this type of
exactly.
body or
Exactly. Yeah, I just like blondes. I just like people who are thin. I just like whatever.
Mhm.
But we were born into a culture and a system that at every turn has reinforced a hierarchy of bodies, and that you get access to more resources the higher up the hierarchy you are. And that includes who you date.
Mhm.
We all know the narrative of, let's say there's a group of guys, and if one of them starts dating somebody who is incredibly attractive, we all know what his friends are going to say. And we all also know that if he dates somebody who's, let's say, fat and disabled,
Mhm.
what everyone's not going to say, but what they're thinking.
Mhm.
And that impacts access to certain spaces.
Mhm.
And that's really important to really think about. If I date somebody who's conventionally attractive, my value goes up in the world because
My social
more
power. Yeah.
people, exactly, I have greater social currency.
Mhm.
And not a lot of people have started unpacking that. And so it's a really confronting thing for a lot of people to think about.
Mhm.
It's not an easy thing. My husband is in a very fit, trim body. He's a weightlifter and he does yoga, and he has almost the exact opposite body experience moving through the world than I do.
Mhm.
And I know that it's hard for him
Mhm.
to go into spaces and see me be uncomfortable, to see spaces that don't fit me. He has to reckon with that constantly.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people are themselves so ashamed or so worried or feeling a sense of lack. Shame is so high at a cultural level. So many of us feel unworthy of love and belonging that we hope to get some of that through who we date. And what's so interesting to me is I've had, like you, many clients come to me and say, I hit perimenopause, or after I had kids, or I just got older, whatever it was, my body has changed, and now my partner doesn't find me attractive anymore. And often, when we start peeling back the layers, it's less that they're not attracted to you anymore, and more that now there's a fear that they're going to be judged.
Mhm.
Exactly, because there is a real narrative of who I date reflects the quality of person that I am. If I date someone attractive, I must be attractive, or there
Yeah, like
must be
my
something valuable.
desirability increases as
Exactly.
their desirability is.
And some people, when they go to their partner and say, "Hey, I am on this journey. I really want to start finding ways to inhabit my body differently. I want to break up with diet culture. I don't want to spend my whole life monitoring my food. I actually want to enjoy myself." There are some people whose partners maybe feel a little threatened. They're not sure what it means, but they're okay. Tell me more. I'll learn about it. And then there are other people who just fundamentally cannot accept that because for them, they struggle with self-worth and that bumps up against it. And then you have to make some hard choices. Do I want to stay in a relationship with somebody who is deciding that how I look
Mhm,
is the value I bring to this relationship?
mhm,
And a
mhm.
lot of us, that's not going to feel very good. I bring
Well,
so many
especially as you're
things.
embodied and you're connected,
Uh-huh.
you're knowing, and what's tolerable now may not have been tolerable. It's changing.
Right.
You're able to tolerate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we are not taught, it's also not an individual thing, right? These are culturally enforced narratives that again help move resources up to the top and
Mhm.
exploit the folks who aren't at the top. We aren't taught from very young ages that bodies are designed to change.
Yeah.
Right? We're not
Yes.
taught that like aging is an important part of our process of being alive on this earth. We're not taught that disability is inevitable and that we're all temporarily able-bodied.
Mhm.
We are taught that youth and only youth and able-bodiedness are valuable. And so we see this invisibilization that happens with aging, with increased disability, with bodies changing. And if we had a different cultural narrative, so many more of us would feel more prepared, more welcomed as we moved into elderhood, as our
Yes.
bodies go through menopause. And so it works set up to fail and to be in these places of real pain,
Mhm.
which is why being able to work with folks who can help you to unpack those narratives and heal some of that can be really helpful, or finding community because
Yeah.
it can feel so isolating. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and to bring us back to where we started, why pleasure is such a radical reclamation in
Yeah.
all of this, to choose that and give that back to yourself in these maybe micro moments.
Mhm.
It's a real shift.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I really appreciate Adrienne Marie Brown's perspective on pleasure because culturally, we also have this narrative that pleasure is about excess,
That's the
spending
societal
money.
definition. Yeah.
Exactly. And often pleasure comes at the expense of someone else,
Mhm.
someone's unpaid labor, those kinds of things. And Adrian invites us to shift, and pleasure is really about satisfaction and joy and aliveness and really just inhabiting our bodies differently.
Mhm.
And so I find that is a really helpful thing in that how if I can come back to pleasure as joy, as satisfaction,
Mhm.
as aliveness. What a beautiful way to move through life.
Wouldn't want
Orienting
that.
towards those things.
Mhm.
Yeah. And to want to connect with other people. One thing that I've learned is that when I'm around people who really embrace their own pleasure, that move towards their yes and their no, who are good with boundaries, they celebrate my pleasure too.
Mhm.
They don't police my pleasure because they
Mhm.
feel so unworthy of their own.
There's so much abundance, right? Like,
Exactly.
mm,
Yeah.
yeah, beautiful exchange.
Yeah.
Dawn, what does it mean to you to take up space in your own life right now?
Mhm. Ooh. I
Mm,
think for me, taking up space right now is a process of turning towards my experience with curiosity and then really honoring it. Just simply being able to check in and does this feel like something I can do right now? No? Okay, then I'm not going to do it. And if other folks are disappointed or frustrated, that's okay. We can still be in relationship with those feelings, but I'm going to really honor my capacity. And I think that's particularly important right now when so many of us, myself included, feel this constant pressure to do more, to be available faster, to respond quickly. There's this pressure, this rush to constantly be available, producing content.
Mhm.
And that's just not sustainable for my body or for any of our bodies. And I think when I think about taking up space, I think about exhaling.
Mm.
I
Mhm.
think about what can this fleshy body do in this
Mm.
moment and
Mm.
saying no to the things that don't feel good or don't feel possible or sustainable, and saying yes as well to the things that would feel life-giving, would feel affirming, and allowing other people to have feelings about those things without feeling like I've done something wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. Mm. Dawn, thank you so much for all of what you've shared today. You are just a bright light in this world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
If folks wanted to connect with you and learn more about you and what you offer, how would you recommend they do that?
Yeah. So my website is tendandcultivate.com. You can learn more about my practice there and connect with me. We've also started a fat mental health provider directory on that website. So if you go to tendandcultivate.com, you'll see the directory, and that has people from around the world who
Mm.
offer counseling, therapy, social workers, coaches who are in fat bodies and who do the work from a place of fat liberation.
Mm.
So definitely check that out. And then you can also follow me on Instagram. I'm either at Tend and Cultivate or Dawn_Serra.
Mhm. Amazing.
Yeah.
Dawn, thank you again. And to everyone listening, thank you for listening. I hope you all find some ways to take up a little more space this week. Thank you for listening to Taking Up Space. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and found it to be a resource for you in your own embodiment, healing, and body liberation journey. I hope you can continue the conversation with me over on social media by sharing your thoughts, offering your ideas and suggestions for future episodes, or just connecting. You can find me on Instagram at Inner Atlas Therapy. If you liked this episode and want to support the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show in your preferred podcast platform. And share this episode with a friend. This ensures that more people can find the pod and will amplify our message of body liberation for all. If you haven't checked it out yet, I have a free Taking Up Space workbook available. This workbook will have you engage in self-reflection and embodied practices as you navigate your own journey of taking up space. You can find this free resource on my website, inneratlastherapy.com. I'll also link in the show notes some additional resources I've developed in my online shop to help you deepen into your own embodiment, healing, and body liberation work. Thanks again for being here. And until next time, I hope you join me in the resistance and find some ways to take up space this week. I'll see you next time.